No?
Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead, please.
Okay. Good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and
Waalaikumsalam.
gentlemen, and welcome to today's guest lecture on behalf of Department of Accountancy, Faculty of Economic and Business, Universitas Airlangga. I'm Amalia Rizky, the moderator of today's guest lecture. We're pleased to see you here and welcome all of you to this guest lecture series. This is series number 1. And as you know, today's guest lectures is about research topics in accounting standards for not-for-profit organization. This is, I think, the rare topics from Professor David Gilchrist. And because our dean today cannot afford this meeting, respectable Vice Dean Dr. Ahmad Rizky Sridadi, SH, MH, and respectable Head of Department of Accountancy, Dr. Wiwi Supratiwi, SAMBA, CACMA, and the Honorable of all Professor and Lecturers of Accountancy who is attend today, and of course all participants of these guest lectures that I cannot mention one by one. I wish you all in good and healthy condition and always happy. That's it. Sorry?
Kadang itu kami kontak, katanya supirnya itu lagi tidak bertugas yang bertugas.
Okay. The schedule arrangement for opening session of this guest lecture will begin by the opening remark by Dr. Ahmad Rizky Sridadi as a Vice Dean of Faculty of Economic and Business. Then I will introduce our speaker today. Will be very interesting, as well as ground rules of this guest lecture. Because before we get started, I would like to remind you to fill the questionnaire that letter we put on the chat pane. Okay. Now, to get started, allow me to welcome the Vice Dean of Faculty of Economic and Business, Universitas Airlangga, to give opening remark for today's guest lecture for Dr. Ahmad Rizky Sridadi. Now the time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Amalia Rizky, for your time and room, for me to have the introduction. The Honorable Professor of Accounting, Professor David Gilchrist from the University of Western Australia, and the Honorable Head of Accounting Department of the Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Airlangga, Dr. Wiwi Supratiwi, and the honorable colleagues, lecturers and students, of course, and the participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Airlangga, I think it is my honor and very great pleasure to be invited and meet you all for the first in this year 2022 for guest lecture series on accounting department. We are privileged and deeply honored to have cooperation with Professor David Gilchrist from the University of Western Australia as today's speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have today, Professor Gilchrist will take all of us into depth discussion to discuss issue primarily dealt with accounting standard for not-for-profit organization as our topics, as you know. And as we know that the accounting profession recently has never been so challenging and important. And in that situation, in a changing demanding and complex world. Our role as a professional accountant is very critical in maintaining the credibility for profit organization. High quality accounting and reporting frameworks, or perhaps new accounting standard, are very essential in facing several issues on how COVID-19 pandemic affects the not-for-profit organization. Therefore, I'm very delighted to see that once more there has been such a strong response from this international guest lecture that our aim for today and tomorrow on recent accounting development, and in that course or in that way to learn from each other's experiences in this field. So in conclusion, I wish everyone here have very fruitful discussion and provide values to the participants through this guest lecture and networking. I challenge each of you to have this guest lecture as a starting point from which your continued development as a professional accountant and our future progress as a global accountancy profession can be measured. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Ahmad Rizky Sridadi. Now, it is time for me to introduce our presenter, Professor David Gilchrist. Professor David Gilchrist is a professor of accounting in the University of Western Australia. He obtained a PhD from University of Notre Dame, Australia, and Professor David Gilchrist holds a number of senior roles in non-profit organization. Non-profit organization. Okay, would you mind to? Okay, I'm so sorry. Professor David Gilchrist holds a number of senior roles in not-for-profit, commercial, and public sectors, such as a chair of National Standard Chart of Account advisory body, Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, chair, Australian Scholarship Limited, and director of Baxter Lowley Advisory. Professor David Gilchrist has some research interest, projects, and publication also, which is has research in the areas of non-profit sustainability, economics, and governance, and has written over 100 industry reports and papers focusing on key issues related to the sector. In 2021, Professor David has several projects. One of them is the Australian Non-Profit Accounting Standard Research Project, as well as the economic contribution and sustainability of the Queensland not-for-profit human service sector, and then the limits of green finance, a survey of literature in the context of green bonds and green loan sustainability. In 2020, Professor David has publication in Australian Journal of Public Administration with the title Independent Review of Emergency Economic Stimulus Measures, Global Financial Crisis and COVID-19. Professor David Gilchrist also has some notable achievements. Some of them are developed the first national reports on charities in Australia, and in 2011, he established the current not-for-profit initiative. That's a very amazing charges. Yeah. Okay. I also read some ground rules in Zoom ethic in this guest lecture. The guest lecture the guest lecture is being recorded and live streamed. And the second one, please, for all the attendants, the participant, to stay muted until called upon. The second one, turn on the camera and use Zoom virtual background that has been shared before, and rename your Zoom account in the format name _ institution name. While in the Q&A process, we use slide do feature. So please, if all of you has the questions, please visit https://www.slide.do and /enter the code number. The code number will be GL0001, or visit the address after this, www.up.slide.do.event and the address over there. Okay, and please treat everyone how you would like to be treated and enjoy this guest lecture. All right, without further ado, I would like to welcome the presenter today, Professor David Gilchrist, to deliver the presentation. All right, Professor David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides okay there?
Okay.
Everything's come up okay?
Yeah.
Of course.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yes.
Well, thank you to Professor Sridhari, Professor Supratiwi, and also Dr. Rizki for all of those kind words. And I must admit, this is the third presentation to this group, and I'm thrilled to be able to do it and looking forward to further collaborations, because it does two things for me. One, it is obviously an opportunity to be able to speak to new and different people about accounting research, which I hold very dear, and I know you do as well. But also it allows for me to think deeply about what it is we do, because sometimes when you're with the same people all the time and you're dealing with the same issues all the time, you perhaps don't think as deeply about what you're doing as you should. So I'm really pleased to be able to do that and thrilled to be able to speak here again. The topic, as you know, is research topics in accounting standards for not-for-profit organisations. And I thought this would be a good topic for two reasons. One is because I think not-for-profit organisations are really important organisations in both of our countries for social advancement, to be able to support people that need support and to be able to ensure that our communities get everything that they need. I think the second reason that it's really important is because the objectives of these organisations are very similar from country to country, and therefore there's a real opportunity here for collaboration. And then thirdly, I think it's a really important topic because, as has already been identified, not a lot of research has really gone into accounting standards for not-for-profit organisations globally. And I think there's great opportunity for us to expand that and to be able to have young researchers and established researchers collaborate to be able to undertake programs of research in this area. And so from my perspective, both as a professor here at UWA, and also I'm really thrilled to be a visiting fellow within your department at Erlanger as well. I want to present this topic and present my comments, but with a view to perhaps taking it to the next step to actually develop some collaborative research projects between our two groups and to be able to see how we might advance that opportunity. In terms of my agenda for today, I want to discuss the key issues in not-for-profit accounting reporting, because of course they form the substance of the questions that we might ask when we undertake our research. I want to identify major topics for research that I think are important and that are certainly developing a lot of momentum here in Australia and around the world in terms of not-for-profit financial reporting. I want to talk to the main projects being undertaken here in Australia and globally. And one of my hopes from this particular discussion is that Erlanger might have one or two people that would like to also join global projects in relation to accounting standard setting for not-for-profit organisations. So I'm hoping that this is an opportunity to perhaps identify some people that might be keen to collaborate internationally, not just with Australia. And then finally, to suggest some opportunities for collaboration between our two universities, some projects that might be useful to think about or that might make some people excited about doing some research in this particular area. Really happy to take questions at the end, or if people have got questions as we go, that's fine too. But what I might ask, Rizky, are you able to just look at the chat rooms and let me know if there's a question, please, that needs to be dealt with, and I'll try and deal with it as we go. I intend to speak for about 40 minutes. Hopefully that's not too much time for everybody, and then I'm free to be able to chat about these topics for 20 or 30 minutes after that. So hopefully we'll be able to exhaust everyone's questions and comments. Okay, so what are the attributes of appropriate accounting standards as a baseline starting point for developing research questions that might be pertinent to this particular sector? Accounting standards have, or good accounting standards have, the same types of attributes regardless of the sector that they report in. And so these attributes of accounting standards, I think, are relevant to not-for-profit organisations, but they're relevant to commerce and public sector in my view. First and foremost, of course, accounting standards must be developed such that the financial reports actually meet the user's needs. And we all know that the users are those people who will use the financial reports to make financial allocative decisions. So they'll actually make decisions about the organisation based on that financial report. And they really only have that financial report and the auditor's report to go by. They don't have the ability to force the organisation to provide additional information. And so the users are really the central point of any research, in my view, around this topic, because they're the ones that are ultimately beneficiaries or that are going to suffer as a result of good or bad accounting standards that are applied in this particular sector. I'll come back to users quite a bit as we go through the presentation. The standards also, though, need to be proportionate in the sense that they need to present information that is materially correct and that allows, in all material respects, the user to understand the financial position and performance of the entity. That is, that the accounting standards should not be overly complex, should not be overly substantial, so that very significant amounts of information are provided, but perhaps the decision usefulness of that information is reduced. The cost of preparation and presentation should be outweighed by the benefits of those financial reports. In other words, the accounting standards should allow for efficient and effective financial reporting and allow for the benefits of financial reporting to outweigh the cost. Unfortunately, accounting and financial reporting is a cost centre for organisations. It's not a profit centre. It's an important aspect in terms of governance, transparency, accountability, as we all know, but it's absolutely critical that the benefits of that financial reporting aren't outweighed by the costs of its production. And this often happens in not-for-profit and public sector entities where we might be more concerned with making sure we tick the box rather than actually presenting information that can support decision making. They need to be understandable. And this is a really important issue as well when we combine that with users' needs, particularly in the not-for-profit sector. Our research in Australia around understandability and users' needs is that we've found that users are very, very short on financial literacy skills. That is, they don't have strong financial understanding, and therefore the financial reports are often too complex to be able to relay a message to those users. And so understandability is an absolutely critical attribute of financial reports, and the accounting standards should support the development and presentation of understandable financial information. The accounting standards should also not get in the way of the timely presentation of financial information. Timely information, of course, is critical because it supports people in making decisions when they need to make it and provides them with the information that they need. At the end of the day, I think it's absolutely critical that the financial accounting standards that are set up for not-for-profit organisations aren't of such substance that they prevent the timely presentation of this information in the context of the audit process as well, of course. And of course, they have to be relevant to decision making. This is a really significant issue in Australia. In Australia at the moment, we have what we call a transaction neutral set of accounting standards. In other words, those accounting standards apply in commerce, in public sector and in not-for-profit organisations. And so it's very questionable as to whether or not the financial reports that are produced are relevant to the decision needs of users of not-for-profit organisations. And this is a really critical issue because going back to the cost of preparation and presentation being outweighed by the benefits, if the financial information is not relevant to the types of decisions that those users have to make, then it's very arguable that the benefits are outweighed by the costs of preparation. So I guess there's two fundamental elements that are really important here then. One is balancing the skills development and simplification. What do I mean by that? Again, in the Australian context, we've conducted research, as I said, which shows that users and often even preparers in not-for-profits and charities don't have significant skills in financial literacy and financial understanding. And so one of the results of that might be to reduce the complexity and simplify financial reports. But we've got to be really careful as well that we don't oversimplify those financial reports instead of conducting training and professional development to be able to lift the bar, to be able to lift the capacity of those users. So there's always a balancing act in not-for-profits and charities in Australia where we're trying to be as simple as we can be in order to meet the information needs of people as they might be, but not to oversimplify and not develop the skills and capacity of those people that might prepare, present and use financial reports in the not-for-profit sector. I think there's a really significant opportunity for research in this area about what is the right balance between simplification and what our expectations should be of particularly directors of charities and not-for-profit organisations in terms of their understanding of financial literacy. Let's not get too simple. Let's try and raise the bar to get people to be able to understand more about what's going on. So the major topics for research that we are involved in and conducting here in Australia are many and varied, and I want to touch on some of those. All of these topics are areas where we would be really happy to welcome potential collaborations with people at Erlanger, but also I know there's people in the audience from other institutions around Indonesia and also Malaysia. We'd be really thrilled to discuss any collaborations in relation to these topics, but I'll step through those and obviously we can talk about that at the end of the session as well. One of the key topics for research relates to asset valuation and not-for-profits and charities. And asset valuation is a really significant issue for any organisation, as we know, because we need to understand the organisation's balance sheet position. So what is its net wealth? But we also need to understand how efficient that organisation is in terms of return on that wealth. So typically in commerce, for instance, we're really interested in the return on the assets that are applied to a particular commercial engagement to make sure that we're getting a good return on the investment. In the not-for-profit sector, we're not so concerned about return on investment. We are concerned about those assets in the context of sustainability of the organisation and it's also its financial position as a going concern, that is that the organisation can pay its bills. Asset valuation often becomes difficult for many classes of assets for not-for-profits and charities because those assets are held in different ways, but also have different applications and different levels of importance for the stakeholders of that organisation. What am I thinking about here? I'm thinking about, for instance, museums that might hold assets such as ancient artifacts or other things that they might have on display. to be able to actually value those things and to be able to put them in the balance sheet is a really complex thing for an organisation that's not able to sell those assets. Similar considerations might relate to mosques and temples and churches and those kinds of buildings that have really important social purpose, but are not the kind of buildings that you might sell or even want to sell at the end of the day as a charity or a not-for-profit organisation. And that might extend to heritage buildings, parliaments, and other public buildings that might be really important. So asset valuation and the difficulty of valuing assets that are heritage assets is a really keen and important major topic of research here in order to be able to understand what the net wealth of a not-for-profit or charity might be. Another one is, and I don't think you'd be surprised at this given my previous comments about users and the financial literacy or their capacity to understand financial reports, but we have a major topic for research underway where we're trying to identify who those users are for not-for-profit and charity financial reports and identify some of their financial literacy capacities, but also what kinds of things we might put in place to be able to lift that literacy in the Australian context particularly. We're also interested in looking at how we might value and how we might report on what we call controlled versus administered assets. Like heritage assets, not-for-profits and charities, certainly in Australia and I'm sure in Indonesia in the same way, receive often philanthropic donations or government grants, or might even receive an asset directly from a provider for a particular purpose. And when you receive that asset or when you receive the grant, there might be requirements in relation to that grant that mean that you can't realise that asset, you can't sell that asset and make money out of that asset to balance your balance sheet because the provider of the asset has made some stipulations or caveats around how it might be used. So an example here might be a philanthropist in Australia particularly gives you money to buy a bus, say, for a school. And they might give you that money on the basis that that bus continues to be used by that school. And then if the school no longer requires the bus, then the bus needs to go to another school to be able to be used for that purpose. That means that in technical accounting terms, that bus is an asset, but in financial reporting terms, the bus can't be realised, it can't be sold, and therefore we would find that might misrepresent the sustainability or the going concern status of the organisation. So being able to account for and present controlled versus administered assets, so those assets that you can sell and do what you want with are controlled assets, administered assets are those assets that that you're unable to realise, unable to sell. How you report those is a really important understandability facet on these types of reports, I think. Consolidation is also a really big issue in many countries like Australia, Canada, the United States and England. I am sorry, I don't know what the situation for consolidation and charities is in Indonesia, but I'd be delighted to find out what kinds of issues you might have there. But consolidation represents a real issue, particularly for religious-based organisations. So you can imagine, for instance, in Australia, many churches have set up all sorts of social organisations, and in accounting terms, there is some question mark about whether those organisations should be consolidated as part of the church's financial reports or whether they should be able to report themselves. We also have Islamic organisations that have done similar things, Hindu, Buddhist and other organisations. So being able to determine what should be consolidated in charity and not-for-profit terms and what shouldn't be is a really significant issue in terms of this area of reporting in Australia and most English-speaking countries. And as I say, I'm sorry, I don't know what the situation is in Indonesia. Performance reporting is also a big issue. So one of the enduring comments that we get from users is we like to know that the finances are fine. We like to know that going concern is okay. In other words, the organisation is financially sustainable. But we do see a lot of people more concerned about whether or not the charity or not-for-profit organisation has performed as efficiently and as effectively as it can. So in other words, financial information is really important. but people are concerned about how many services are provided, who they're provided to, whether they were the right services and whether they were effective services. And so performance reporting extends beyond the finances of the organisation to discuss whether or not the organisation actually did the things that it was set up to do and whether it did those things efficiently and effectively. In Australia, this has been a really difficult thing for us to be able to develop. The Australian Accounting Standards Board has had an exposure draft, I think, for over 10 years looking at performance reporting, and we haven't got any closer to a solution in that regard. So this is an area, again, where I think there would be great opportunity for collaboration, because there's no regulatory or other difference between performance reporting in Indonesia or in Australia, and where I think there would be great, as I say, opportunity for that collaboration. The idea of profit versus surplus is also a really significant issue, where in most English-speaking countries, charities and not-for-profit organisations don't report profits, they report what we call surpluses, which in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, reporting a surplus suggests that that money is actually not required for the organisation. However, any charity or not-for-profit organisation operating in a mixed market economy like that in Indonesia or in Australia does need to make a profit in order to be sustainable. And so one of the things that we've been investigating under this heading, for instance, is earnings management in disability services charities. And we've found that those charities actually do undertake earnings management to report smaller profits, often break even, but often losses as well, because they're concerned that people won't understand why a charity needs to make a profit in order to be financially sustainable. A final or a further point relates to what we call non-monetised resources. Everyone, I'm sure, in the meeting would be aware that charities and not-for-profit organisations have donations of goods, not just of money. And they would also be aware that those organisations often have the use of volunteer time, and to apply that volunteer time. And so one of the elements that we're looking at is whether or not that volunteer time and those donated goods should be priced into the income statement and the balance sheet in order to give a much more comprehensive view of the consumption of assets and the consumption of resources that organisation has applied to undertake its activities. The other thing about these non-monetised resources is when we talk about the cost of service delivery, we typically talk about the income and expenditure associated with that service delivery, but there is, of course, non-monetised donations that need to be taken into consideration to ensure that that cost of service delivery is reported appropriately. I guess the other thing, and this is a COVID issue particularly, or it's emphasised in COVID, is where organisations can no longer have volunteers, or where donations are not being made of goods and services because of some crisis like COVID. What kind of impact does that have on the organisation, and where does the organisation get its financial resources to continue to provide the services that it needs to provide? And I think this is a really important topic too, because charities and not-for-profit organisations in many respects are set up to support people in bad economic times and difficult crisis times. And it's in those crisis times, of course, that donations and volunteer time tends to shrink. So in other words, when charities are at their peak demand and need as much resources as they can to support people, those resources are actually shrinking. And so not only is non-monetised resources important, pardon me, to report in order to understand the viability of the organisation, but the prospective viability, so the forecast viability, is important as well. And I think the COVID environment is a great natural experiment to actually consider these things. Audit not-for-profit organisations is also a really important issue. It's important because of that lack of financial literacy that I've talked about before in users, but it's also important because the audit process itself needs to be focused on those elements that are efficient and effective. And we're finding, particularly in Australia, auditors don't necessarily understand and appreciate the nuances of difficulty in reporting in not-for-profits and charities. And so we find that there's a skill gap in auditors' understanding in relation to these organisations as well. The final point that I want to make here too extends to a more philosophical approach to this material. One of the things that we're really trying to do in UWA is to promote research into the not-for-profit charitable sector as being orthodox accounting standards research processes. So in other words, as certainly Dr. Risky, I think, mentioned, but others have mentioned too, that this is not-for-profit and charitable accounting standards are not a common topic in schools of accounting around the world. They are a really important topic, and we're trying to raise the profile of research in this area so that more and more schools will take this up as legitimate research, but also so that early researchers come into this area and perhaps conduct their PhD or honours examinations of the sector rather than going to more typical topic areas to be able to raise the profile of this research. Okay, so what are some of the challenges that are relating to this process? Certainly there is an enormous challenge in a lack of data. In most countries, other than the US, where they've been collecting tax data for charities and not-for-profit organisations for quite some years, there is an extraordinary lack of data in terms of understanding the financial position and performance of these organisations, or more broadly, who they employ, and so forth. In Australia, we have very, very limited and frankly, low quality data for the last 10 or so years from the establishment of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, but we don't have much data before that, and we certainly don't have high quality data. So one of the things that we're keen to focus on is creating those data assets to be able to support early researchers and PhD candidates and the like to be able to conduct the research that I'm talking about. We also have a lack of capacity to engage with users, and again, I'm not so sure of the position in Indonesia, although I suspect it's similar to that of Australia, in the sense that being able to identify users and communicate with users of financial reports for research purposes is very difficult. A very, very significant amount of research that's being conducted in relation to financial reporting for not-for-profit and charitable organisations has been conducted by access to accountants, preparers and auditors, and people within the accounting profession, which, as I'm sure you can appreciate, would give a very particular view of these issues and what needs to be done, and doesn't really get to the heart of those users that are going to be the audience for these reports. And so in Australia, there's a real weakness amongst a lot of the research that we conduct where we actually haven't spoken to users, we've spoken to preparers and auditors about what those users might or might not want. Competing priorities are also, of course, a challenge, and particularly for the not-for-profit sector, in terms of being able to have them provide data, being able to have them to be able to participate in research programs and so on is quite difficult. I think that's probably the same in Indonesia as well, because they tend to be understaffed organisations, they tend to be lacking in resources, and therefore they're struggling to be able to then respond to research, which I think is in the long term a real difficulty for the sector as well. I think our research is really important for the sector, but it's a really significant issue that we try and deal with. The fourth significant issue, and this may well be an Australian issue, I suspect it's probably an issue in the UK and US as well, but and countries like Canada. I'd love to know what the situation is in Indonesia, but not-for-profits and charity regulation in this country are a very low priority. There's not much money spent by governments in supervising and regulating these organisations, and therefore there's not a lot of priority put into responding to regulatory requirements, which means that at the end of the day, organisations aren't investing in their understanding of financial reporting. So that low regulatory priority environment means that the need for organisations to feel comfortable with their financial reporting is less substantial than, say, organisations on the stock market, listed on the stock market, or commercial organisations that have to pay tax and submit tax returns. So those problems notwithstanding, As you can see here, one of the responses that we've developed in Australia is the establishment of the Australian Non-Profit Accounting Standards Research Program. And we'd love to articulate this into an Indonesian audience as well, and to engage with Indonesian people on this program as well, because I think that collaboration would be really useful and really helpful. As you can see, I'm the chief investigator for this particular program, but the idea is to involve multiple universities researching in the area of not-for-profit accounting and reporting. And you can see here that the University of Western Sydney, the Queensland University of Technology, and also Newcastle universities are involved in the project, as well as the Institute of Community Directors. So those people that are charged with the governance of not-for-profits and charities in Australia. And our idea is to focus on the introduction of workable accounting standards and focus on increasing the utility in standards and the understanding of their purpose. So this is really focused on those issues that I raised at the commencement of my presentation, trying to come up with answers, but not just academic answers, but also trying to communicate into the sector itself the findings of our research, and to be able to support the sector to be able to grow in that respect. My understanding is everyone has a copy of these slides, and you can see that we have a link to our website included in them. And obviously I'd be delighted if you visited the website, and of course please let me know if there's anything I can answer or respond to. But the Australian Non-Profit Accounting Standards Research Program is expanding and has been developing now for about 18 months, and will continue to expand that and drive that in order to support the development of good accounting standards for not-for-profits. The key things that we've undertaken in this particular program include topics being investigated, such as that decision usefulness. So whether the accounting standards result in financial reports that actually make sense. I've also spoken already about earnings management in charities and not-for-profit organisations, and also user identification. We've got major projects underway looking at those two things. And again, they're areas where I think collaboration would be really fantastic. Given my comments, not-for-profit asset valuation and not-for-profit audit are also major project lines that we're looking to pursue. And again, I think there's opportunity for collaboration there as well. We do have a major project on at the moment with Otago University in New Zealand, looking at not-for-profits and sustainability in crises. And obviously COVID is a fantastic environment to be undertaking this particular research, but looking at things like blockchain and whether blockchain and technology can answer some of the questions or be supportive of financial reporting more effectively for organisations. And then the last group of topics being investigated are not-for-profits and competing logic. So this is a management accounting topic that people might be interested in, but where we're looking at the fact that not-for-profits and charities have, as you know, two competing priorities. One priority is to be financially sustainable and to be able to build the economic resources they need to be able to deliver services into the future. But the other is also to be able to pursue their mission, to do all of the social things that they need to preserve, to undertake. And so there needs to be a balance between being commercial and being social, and making sure that you're keeping the organisation sustainable, but you're not over profitable and under delivering on services. And so we think that's a really important element to think about as well. I've included a link there to give you some thoughts on and to an understanding of what we've been up to. Again, please click on the link and have a look at some of the publications that we've developed as a result of these research outcomes or research processes. I mentioned in my introduction, I wanted to talk to the international financial reporting project as well, because I think this is an area where Erlanger might decide to engage, and where there might be an opportunity for Erlanger to participate from an Indonesian perspective in terms of not-for-profit accounting standards at that global level. The International Financial Reporting for Non-Profit Associations project, or IFAR for NPO, has been going for a few years now, and it's a project that's really focused on trying to develop a minimum set of accounting standards at the international level that can be applied to not-for-profits and charities. So I sit on the the Practitioners Advisory Group, and we've been contributing into that project as part of our project here at the Australian Nonprofit Accounting Standards Research Program. But this is an area, as I said before, where someone from Indonesia might want to be engaged. And if you do, please contact me and I'll make the necessary introductions to get you engaged in this project. The partners for the project are SIPFA, so the Public Sector Finance Association in England, and Humentum, which is an English-based charity organisation or development organisation. We have country champions and practitioner advisory group. As I said, I'm on the practitioner advisory group. We have a country champion in Australia, so someone who's the key contact. There isn't, as I understand it, a country champion in Indonesia. And I know that the project leads would love to hear from someone in that regard as well. So again, it might be something that someone from Erlanger might feel that they would like to participate in. The link to IFR for MPO is provided there, so please feel free to go to that link. And of course, make contact in your own right if you want. I'd be delighted, as I say, to make any introductions if you think that's useful. Okay, so then the final piece, I've spoken about collaboration and opportunities for collaboration throughout the presentation, but I thought I'd just raise a couple of key things that might be starters to be able to get people thinking about the kinds of things they might be involved in. At the end of the day, I'm also really happy to get suggestions from your perspective as well. So this is just my experience and what I've been doing and what we've been doing as a group here in Australia and internationally. But there would, I'm sure, be things that are relevant specific to Indonesia, and I'd love to be able to chat about those, and perhaps there are areas that we can collaborate in as well. So these are just suggestions, and they can be added to, I'm sure. First and foremost, I thought it would be a really useful thing perhaps to conduct a comparative assessment of present state regarding charitable and non-profit financial reporting between our two countries. We might be able to include further countries. For instance, New Zealand would be a logical one from my perspective, but there might be other countries as well that might want to participate in such a thing. The idea might be to look at topics such as the accounting standards that are applicable, the regulatory requirements that are applicable, but also some of the weaknesses and challenges for financial reporting for organisations between our two countries, and obviously look at what is similar and what might be different in order to conduct that comparative understanding. As I say, I think it would also be really useful to add other countries to that mix to be able to make it much more interesting across a number of countries to perhaps explore the same sorts of things. One of the outputs from this kind of project might be an edited volume, and it might be that someone from Erlanger wants to co-edit the volume as well as be involved in the development of this particular resource. And again, I'm really open to suggestions and open to discussions in that regard. The second one is a really important one, and that is user identification and needs analysis. What do the audience actually need, as opposed to what do accountants and regulators think they need, and what should be in those accounting standards? I think there's a really, this is a really fundamental element, and I think there's a great opportunity for us to think about users jointly. I'm sure there are some particular nuances in the Indonesian experience as there are in Australian, but I'm also sure that there are some significant similarities, and being able to demonstrate that similarity is important in terms of our countries working together on some of these problems to be able to resolve them. Again, an output here might be an edited volume, but it might also be papers for academic journals or other resources that you think might be useful. The third element might be a similar comparative assessment, but looking at the state of the sector. In our research group, we've been looking at the state of human services organisations for some time now. So in other words, looking at whether or not they're increasingly sustainable or decreasing in sustainability, what the cost increases are in their environment, and what other challenges they face in delivering services. It might be that we can have a comparison between our two countries in terms of what the economic and operational state of the sector is in those countries and how that operation comes out. So it might be, again, an output might be an edited volume or academic papers. Similarly, the state of the sector comparative assessment might involve other countries as well that you might think we should engage with. And I'd be delighted to chat about that further. So that's all I wanted to go through. I've spoken fairly quickly, but I hope it has been a useful discussion. I'm always really happy to be contacted. My email address is there, as you can see, and so please do that. But I'm wondering if, Dr. Rizki, we go to any questions or comments or see what other people might have to say. And I'll stop sharing. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, you are still in mute.
Ibu Lia masih mute, Bu Lia.
Okay, sorry. So sorry, Professor David. Thank you, Professor, for giving us such an informative and interesting presentation.
My pleasure.
That's very useful, I think. And then, Professor and ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to begin answering questions that already submitted in Slido. I found it three first questions. Do you like to hear, or maybe I have to?
If you could repeat, that'd be the questions. That would be good.
I already have the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
For the question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Share that.
Panitia, boleh minta tolong saya bisa share screen? This one. Okay. Okay, the first one. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Is it already? Not yet, yeah. Sorry. I'm sorry. It is. Okay. This on screen now?
Not yet.
No. Not yet. Okay.
Okay, you can read it.
Okay. Sorry. I share this. Maybe I have to stop share first, then. This one. All right.
Perfect.
The first question is from Mr. Agung Gede. He is a lecturer of Airlangga University. And the question is, in case for organization based on culture, local wisdom, heritage, and indigenous, what challenge to obtain their data?
Yeah, there's real challenges in obtaining data. And I guess I hark back to my, I think it was the second presentation where we looked at research methods in accounting. And one of the things that I think is really often overlooked in accounting research is qualitative research, so interviewing people rather than sending out surveys in order to understand better those people. So I think there are real challenges. We have similar challenges here in Australia in terms of Indigenous people and communities in remote areas and being able to find out what their thoughts are. And we use interview techniques to be able to do that. And there might be two ways of doing that. One might be one-on-one interviews. One other way is to use panel interviews. So getting 4 or 5 people around a table and talking to those people about the issues that you want to identify in order to be able to then understand what kind of information they might need. So I think it's true to say that there are challenges in relation to to obtaining that data. But I think qualitative research processes and methodologies are really a good way to support that. The other thing to remember too is that I think generally there is a phenomenal opportunity for research in accounting in the context of culture, local wisdom, heritage, indigeneity, and so on. So I think that's one of the things that Indonesia, for me, Indonesia is such a fascinating country because there are so many different people with so many different historical and other backgrounds. The geography is different, so much that really makes such a contribution in this area possible. So not only are there difficulties in terms of obtaining that data, but I think if those challenges can be overcome, there's a real opportunity for some fantastic work to come out of that kind of focus area, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's it. Thank you, Professor David. And the second question is from Anonymous. I think somebody who doesn't want to be mentioned the name. This is the topic. This is the question of the topic areas.
Yeah.
You highlighted which areas are more feasible in terms of availability of data. Can you give example in the context of Australia?
Yeah, so probably the structure of assets and asset valuation is the most logical because that information in terms of charities is provided to government on a regular basis. So at least there's some data there. So I think that is probably the easiest one to deal with. The other area that I think there's great opportunity in Australia, it relates to audit. So when we talk to auditors, of course, we're able to, and we do this qualitatively through interviews and panel sessions, but we're able to talk to peers in terms of their understanding of accounting standards and what they're there for. And therefore, there's a real opportunity to gather information. One of the key difficulties of gathering information is that lack of availability of data, but also lack of understanding of the audiences that you're trying to elicit responses from. Because they don't understand accounting, there is a gap between them and the researcher in terms of trying to make sure they actually understand the question, if that makes sense. And that probably holds true in terms of the previous question as well, and why interviews and roundtables are great, because you can actually, in an interview or a roundtable, you can explain what accountants think and where they come from, and then to be able to put questions that might be able to inform accounting thinking going forward.
Okay. Thank you, Professor David. And next question is from Ahmad Saiful Hidayat Anwar, whether NSFS really need to be audited, or how to measure the performance of NSFS.
This is a really good question and a really important question. And it's a good question because when we look at not-for-profit charitable organisations in this country, and I suspect it's the same in Indonesia, the vast majority are very small organisations turning over very limited amounts of money. And often the regulatory environment and the expectations of these organisations to report is much greater than a similar sized organisation in commerce, for instance. And so I think this is an incredible, first and foremost, I think this is a really important question, because there's a philosophical balance between the fact that not-for-profits and charities, in the Australian context certainly, are given significant tax advantages. So if you like, the public says, okay, if you're a charity, you don't have to pay tax. Your staff don't have to pay tax on fringe benefits, so things like company cars and so on. As a result of that benefit, of that opportunity, you do need to be accountable and transparent. But if you're a small charity, the proportion of cost to achieve that accountability and transparency of your total income or your total expenditure is much higher. And so the question is really a critical one. The other question is whether or not these organisations really need to be audited, and whether things like financial reviews are better than audit. So undertaking a review to assess whether or not there is evidence of anything wrong, as opposed to talking about the presentation of financial reports complying with the accounting standards. The third element that's really important here is in the case of not-for-profit organisations, whether auditing might be actually undertaken entirely differently as an operational audit process over 5 years. In other words, that the auditor comes in and looks at the structure of the organisation and how it operates, rather than looking at the finances and working out whether the financial report's appropriate or not. And so in the Australian context, I think this is an important issue, because increasingly organisations aren't publishing financial reports. Increasingly, they're just publishing summaries, but are more concerned about being able to report their performance, as I said before, so whether they've done the things that they need to do. Which extends then to the final point that I want to make on this really important question, and that is that when we audit a not-for-profit or charity, we audit the finances, obviously, but should we be auditing other data that focuses on performance of the organisation? So how many people it supported, whether it did the right things or the expected things that it was supposed to do for the money that government or philanthropist has given it. So I think this is an enormous question. There's a lot to take into consideration, but this is part of our audit and not-for-profits program, and an area where I think there's great opportunity for collaboration, because there's so much to think about in this context.
Okay, thank you. Professor David, actually, I still have question that sent by WhatsApp. Can I just read it?
Of course.
For you? Okay.
Yeah.
This is from Yanuar Nugroho, the lecturer of vocational school in vocational faculty in Universitas Airlangga.
Yeah.
In Indonesia, we refer the government accounting standard that is called vsAP number 7, the year 2010 statement number 69, that heritage assets must be recorded in the number of unit without value. Okay.
Yeah.
So many studies try to confirm case studies of heritage assets, for example, research on a temple or a museum, but the weaknesses in this research is the law of level of external validity, how to overcome or treat the problem so that it can be published in reputable journal.
Yes, that's a really good point, and I'd be delighted, for instance, to have a look at what I'm sorry, I've forgotten the person's name, but what they have done, and to be able to share that. So if they're happy to contact me and share that, I'd be delighted to look at their paper. But I think the difficulty is very much around how you empirically define what a heritage asset is compared to another asset. So there's a real problem around definition, and then a problem around, and definition is really important. So if I think of a church in Australia, just to use an example, you might have, for instance, we have just down the road from UWA, a very old church that is built out of stone and is not a church that can be replaced. But we might also have a church that's very new and just is not a significant building and can easily be replaced. So just because it's a church doesn't mean that it necessarily is a heritage asset. And so that definition, I think, is a really important element. In terms of the broader issues around the evidence in the data, I think it's probably better for me to have a look at the paper before I comment, because I'd only be able to make very general comments at this stage, I think.
Okay. Professor, actually, we still have some question.
Yeah, I'm happy if you're happy. Yeah.
Can I just read it?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. This is from Aang Kunaifi. How about endowment fund presentation in NFP financial report? Does valuation matter?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So in an endowment fund, I think valuation does matter, because an endowment fund is there for a particular purpose. And in fact, the core of an endowment fund is maintaining the value, the asset value, while generating income, as we know. And so I think valuation is a really important aspect of that, because effectively, in my mind anyway, an endowment fund is a financial instrument or an investment process. So to me, that valuation is critical. But also I guess the rider is in the context of the organisation that has that endowment and how you move forward. So one of the things that needs to be taken into account in valuing the endowment is, if I endow a charity with some money and I specify what that money can be spent on, then that becomes a really important issue going forward, because it restricts the use of that money, as you can see. So an endowment is for a particular purpose, and therefore that can have an impact on the financial reporting. At the end of the day, in the Westminster system countries, so in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United Kingdom, USA, if an endowment or a specific purpose donation is made to an organisation, a charity, then there is a process called a SCI-PRE process that you have to undertake to be able to change that use. And that means that you actually have to go to a Supreme Court, and you have to get the court to agree that that money or that endowment can be used for something different than was intended. So it's a very significant issue in the certainly in the Australian context, and it means that valuation is complex, because it's not just about the monetary value, it's about the value to the organisation moving forward, and whether or not it can use the money for what it wants to or needs to use it for.
Okay, the next question is from Sudarini. Okay, in Indonesia, we have simple little community organization that consists of around 10 houses. It is called rumah tangga, RT, rukun tetangga. Do you think RT need accounting for non-profit organization too? Thank you.
Yeah, with 10 households, I mean, and I'm supposing, so I'm just I'm ignorant of how they operate and how much money's involved and so on. But one of the things that New Zealand has done, and I encourage you to look at the New Zealand not-for-profit accounting standards, because they've been very pioneering in how they've developed their accounting standards, and they have a set of cash accounting standards for very small organisations. And so I think there are needs to be able to identify or to make sure there's appropriate transparency, and that we minimise the opportunity for disputes in these kinds of environments. And disputes can be, these environments, I think, at the very local level with small organisations and families involved, they can actually be more substantial in terms of disputes than national organisations where people don't feel connected, or where they don't feel that they're actually putting their money into it. Does that make sense? So that, you know, if you had a small group of 10 households, 10 families, and everyone contributes or in some way generates an opportunity out of the charity, then there's greater opportunity for those people to be in dispute, because we can see how much is going to where and who's doing what. Whereas for a national charity, people aren't connected in that way. So I think that there is a need to explore that, but those New Zealand accounting standards are really where I would start in terms of any exploration in that area.
Okay, Professor, this is actually a question from myself.
Yeah.
As a young researcher, I think.
Yeah.
It's just about the technique of research. What do you think about the opportunity to do the research in quantitative, or is it better to be qualitative research? And then do you have any suggestion for further readings for this research? And then the other one, what is the best ground theory that we have to use in this research?
Oh, gosh. Well, what we might do is actually take it offline, and I'll share some articles, and I'd be happy to discuss your specific circumstances. So I'd be delighted to do that. Look, I think there's a number of comments that I might make there. The first one is that I would be looking as a young researcher at qualitative and quantitative research. So mixed methods, which we discussed in my presentation, I think last time. And why is that? Well, mixed methods, I think, gives you a much more, a much deeper understanding of what's going on, being able to speak to people as opposed to getting them to answer specific questions, I think allows you to understand better. And I would have interviews that help me set up the survey, have the survey, and then have interviews at the end to confirm what I found out in the survey. The other thing is that in the English-speaking academic journals, qualitative research is becoming more popular. So it hasn't been popular for a long time. I'm sure many in the audience would understand and have experience of that. But there's no doubt that journals are now saying that they need to think about qualitative research. And so as a young researcher, you're on the crest of a wave that is coming, and being able to develop skills, I think, will give you an advantage over perhaps some of the more settled researchers who are quantitatively focused only. So I'd encourage you to look at that. I think the third thing that I would say in relation to that debate, and it's relevant to my mixed methods comment previously, I think it really is important for scholars to have both an understanding of quant and qualitative research outcomes. I think it's gone are the days when scholars can simply be one or the other. And increasingly, I think the next 5 or 10 years will demonstrate that you have to have both those skills, because the two inform each other really well. And I think that they give a much deeper result to the research than just simply qualitative or quantitative. In terms of theories, this is a really difficult question to answer, and why I think we should take it offline, because it does, of course, depend on your research topic and the kinds of things that you're interested in. I guess I would say that generally speaking, the theories are very similar to those in the for-profit accounting research area. So for instance, looking at earnings management, we do it the same way, we execute the project the same way. We did get results that were diametrically opposite to results that we find in the commercial sector, because people are incentivized to reduce profit in charities, not to increase profit, which they are in commerce. So I'm kind of reticent to talk about specific theories in that regard. But I guess there's a couple of things, and I'd be delighted to chat with you personally, and we can do that. I'd be delighted to chat with a group of people if you think there are a group of people that might be interested in that. And you know, if you haven't had enough of me, if you're not sick of me, I'd be delighted to present on that topic too at this research seminar, if you think that's something that people would be interested in hearing about.
Okay, thank you, Professor David.
Okay.
I think that's enough. The question is already answered by Professor David. It is very interesting topics, and in my opinion, we have to do some good research to set so further we can set the better standard for the accounting and profit standard for not for-profit organization. And thank you, Professor David. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's guest lecture. Sorry for the participant. Don't forget to attend our next guest lecture to get the certificate. And then the next guest lecture will be held on Tuesday, 22 March 2022 at 10 a.m. Western Indonesian time. The topic is the transformation to data analytics, robotic process, automation and beyond. And the speaker is Dr. Angela Liu from University of Auckland, New Zealand. The moderator is Mr. A.A. Gede Satya Utama. Thank you, everyone. On behalf of Department Accountancy, Faculty of Economic and Business, Universitas Airlangga, and our presenters today, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Assalamualaikum. Good morning.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.